Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the first of our multi-part webinar series called The Election, Managing Difficult Conversations. Today, we will be taking you through tips and strategies to navigate difficult conversations leading up to the election day in the classroom, with colleagues, and in the community. My name is Disha Mahendro, and I serve as the Director of Diversity Initiatives and Community Relations for USC Dornsife. Some of you here on this webinar today from USC Dornsife may be familiar with our Wellbeing webinar series that we have partnered with the Office of Campus Wellbeing Education to facilitate a series of well-being and diversity-centered webinars to engage our faculty and staff during this remote period. We have hosted 4 webinars thus far on topics like well-being in remote environments, intergenerational well-being, navigating loss and grief through COVID-19, and burnout, which you can all find on our Office of Diversity website. For this series, though, we are embarking on today, it's a 4-part series, and it's focused for our USC community to navigate this tumultuous period. We are joined today by our campus partners from USC Rossier, Campus Wellbeing and Education, Center for Excellence in Teaching, and the Center for the Political Future. Our panel discussion will be moderated by Dr. Darlene Robles. Give us a wave, Darlene. She's the professor of clinical education at USC Rossier and was also the former superintendent of LA County Office of Education. In addition to teaching at Rossier, she leads the program development efforts in conjunction with faculty, external organizations, and experts. She herself is also an expert in the areas of urban education, program development, and school leadership. Before I turn this over, I will go over our agenda briefly and some housekeeping rules to ensure the flow of our webinar today. We will first be hearing from Dr. Quade from Campus Wellbeing and Education, who will contextualize the focus of today's webinar. We'll then hand it over to Dr. Robles to introduce our panelists and discuss managing difficult conversations through each of their respective lenses. For those of you attending today, you will be able to chat with us directly and also submit your questions via the Q&A feature. We will be taking your questions towards the end of the panel discussion. I'd like to thank Dean Kimberly Freeman for helping us to moderate today's Q&A. And Quade, the floor is now yours.
Great, thank you, Disha, and thanks to the panelists and for Dr. Robles for being here. I'd first like to just thank all of the people in attendance here and just recognize the courage that it takes to even sign up for and then follow through with attending a panel like this, with a topic that could be so contentious and potentially incite fear in us, right? I mean, the election is such a, and politics these days are such powerful topics, and they can really be challenging to think of and to even think of managing conversations like that in our classrooms or in the teams that we might lead or be a part of. So I'd really like to just recognize the courage that it takes for all of you to be here and commend you for wanting to learn some strategies and skills about what it might take to manage these conversations as they might appear. And, you know, in that, we recognize the fear that exists for not just the people in attendance, but for all of us as we have to manage these conversations in our own departments and in our own classrooms as well. This is not easy for us, although we hope that by having this conversation and providing this platform for you all, by focusing on strategies and acknowledging the difficulty, you might leave a bit more prepared should you find yourself in the midst of this. You know, there are many valid reasons why it might be difficult to think about managing conversations like this. And in our conversations with staff and faculty, one of the first is, well, what sort of skills do I even have to manage a conversation like this? I don't know what to do. And many people then follow that up with, I'm not a conflict mediator, I'm not a psychologist, I'm not a social worker. I don't feel like I have any power to be able to make comment on the dynamics of conversations that unfold on my teams or with the people that I work with. Another concern that people have been voicing is, well, what if in having a conversation, I rupture the relationships that I've been working to create with my staff, with my teams, or that the students have been working to create in the class with each other? And that's a real important one, right? Are we able to have conversations about difference in a way that we still leave respecting each other and can have civil discourse? And that's a real fear that we recognize and understand that you might have as well. You know, another experience that many faculty and staff have is the belief that, you know what, this isn't my responsibility. I'm here for content. I'm here to teach people about the topics of the class, and that's really it. And That's just a sense of how you identify yourself either as faculty or as a manager. This is a workplace. We're not here to talk about people's feelings or experiences. And that's a sentiment that many have as well. And then others may also believe in free speech at all costs, and that people are allowed to say what they will if it's what they believe in. And these are just some of the experiences or thoughts or feelings that you might be having as you sit here now, as you think about what it might be like for you to engage in a discussion with your fellow employees or the people that you manage, or in your classrooms as well. You know, we recognize though that the challenge is that because these topics are so front and center in nearly every aspect of life today for so many, and have been for decades for many and their entire lives for others, that it can be very much the case that whether you like it or not, or feel prepared or not, these challenging conversations may present themselves when you least expect it. And because of that, we really do, again, congratulate you and commend you on taking the steps to prepare yourself for what those conversations might be like. And what we're going to do today, what the panelists are going to do, and Darlene, are really explore what some of those strategies are that you can do to help facilitate those conversations with others. What we do want to point out, though, is that as you prepare to engage with others, a really important first step is being able to connect with yourself first, right? To understand what your own opinions are on the topics of the day, what your own attitudes and beliefs and biases are towards the topics that so many people have attitudes, beliefs, and opinions on, because you're going to be bringing those with you into the conversations that you have with others. And so whether you're anticipating nervously a conversation that might happen, or whether you're planning for it, being able to connect with your own internal thoughts and feelings and experiences is going to be really invaluable, so that you're aware of yourself, what your trigger points are, or what your sensitive points are, so that you can be aware when they do come up in these conversations, that you've had an opportunity to connect with them before your conversations in audience with others. So in addition to checking in with your attitudes and beliefs, it's important to also just remind yourselves of what you believe your roles and responsibilities are, right? And whether you believe you have responsibility, or whether the people you're managing or teaching believe you have a responsibility, it's going to be important for you to understand the nuance there. And if you don't believe it's your role, but others do, you're going to have to figure out how to work through that, and whether that's in conversation with peers or work yourself. It's going to be an important piece to this. And then finally, to think about your goals in a conversation, what you would hope to achieve, whether that's a goal that everyone is reconciled and everyone's on the same page, probably not attainable. If your goal is to create a space where people can feel brave to bring up their perspectives, that's something to consider as well. And then your reserves. What reserves do you have that you're drawing on from your own emotional or psychological wells to participate and to facilitate a conversation that might seem taxing, right? And making sure that you're checking in with yourself to understand whether you feel capable of handling a conversation like that, or how you might need to lean on other resources that are available to you to help you in those. So in getting into, I'm going to turn it over to Darlene and the panel, but we just encourage you to also, as you're thinking about how to manage the dynamics of others, to think about what your own lived experience is of this, and how you are connected to your own self as you are a human in this world and have your own experiences, how you're bringing that to the space as well. So with that, thanks for considering that. I'd like to turn this over now to Dr. Darlene Robles. Oh, Darlene, I think you're on mute.
Right. Okay, so I'll start again. Thank you, Quade and Disha, for the nice introduction. It truly is my honor to be with an esteemed group of panelists who I think are right for what I call the perfect storm today. It's a perfect storm because we're isolated in the COVID pandemic. We're going through some economic issues. We're going through a very turbulent political election, and then the racial injustice that the reckoning that we have to take care of right now. I don't know that any of us could have predicted this last January at all. And so the emotions that we're feeling, thank you, Quade, for providing this opportunity to get in touch with it, are real, and they have to be really taken care of, and that so that we can engage and continue to do the work that we're doing as faculty and staff and supporting our students and our community. So again, it is my honor to be here today, and I'm going to moderate. I'm going to have some questions, but it's going to be kind of a conversation as well. And so, but before I do, I want to introduce our panelists. It's my pleasure to introduce Kamy Akhavan, who is the Executive Director of the USC Dornsife, thank you, a Center for the Political Future. He is the former CEO of procon.org, the nation's leading source of nonpartisan research on controversial issues, and now leads a Center for the Political Future at USC. As the Executive Director, Kamy oversees the operations of all center components, including the UNRU, Institute of Politics, the Fellows Program, the USC Dornsife LA Times Poll, and Community and Global Education Engagement. Welcome, Kamy. Thank you for being here today. A second panelist is Ingrid Steiner. Ingrid is the Assistant Director of Arts and Humanities Faculty Development for Center for Excellence in Teaching. She works in partnership with faculty and departments on enhancing best practices in pedagogy, and Ingrid brings her expertise and passion for teaching and learning to all higher education institutions here at the university and others as well. Ingrid is currently a doctoral student in our own USC Rossier ED program. So proud to have her be part of the Rossier family, where she explores topics in motivation, relevancy, faculty wellness, and accessibility. Thank you, Ingrid, for being with us today. Say hi. Our third panelist is Ilene Rosenstein. Ilene is the Associate Vice Provost, Campus Wellbeing Education, and is probably very well known right now in many departments and schools in this area of her department. Prior to this position, she was the Director of Student Counseling Services at USC for 9 years, and prior to that was the Director of Counseling at the University of Pennsylvania for 18 years. Thank goodness you're with us now, Ilene. She has served as a professional consultant and university administrator for over 30 years, focusing on mental health, positive psychology, and well-being. She is interested in how to help individuals, groups, and communities and institutions thrive to reach their full potential. So I'll start right now asking each panelist to just share a few minutes of or topics of why you believe that this topic is so important at this particular moment in time. Why we're doing this, our partners together, hear why we think this is important. I'm going to start with you, Kamy.
Well, thanks, Darlene. Thanks for the introduction. And for those of you who haven't had a chance to meet yet, nice to meet you. This is as good as we're going to do on Zoom, and I'll take it over nothing. It's really an honor for me to be able to speak to you folks. I'll tell you a little bit about myself because it'll put all of this in kind of context. For me, the question that you asked, Darlene, is a very personal question because I was born in the backseat of a taxi cab in Tehran, Iran. I grew up in South Louisiana, where in my rural community, the most common last names were Thibodeau, Zachary, and Cormier. And I moved to California as a teenager. The last names around me were Gonzalez and Lopez. And I've always been a person who has had to adapt and change, always been the person who has had to bridge divides. That has been my role personally. Professionally, that's exactly what I've been doing as well. I ran an organization called procon.org. We looked at the pros and cons of controversial issues, about 80 of them, and served an audience over the course of my 14 years of about 300 million people in about 97 countries. I worked with over 13,000 schools in all those places, in all 50 states, in all those countries. I've learned a lot of practical lessons from being in the middle of debates between anti-vaxxers and people who are for vaccines, between law enforcement, gun right advocates, and gun control activists. My research has been referenced by the Palestinian Authority and the Israeli Knesset on the Arab-Israeli conflict. I've been in the middle of debates between medical marijuana activists and the law enforcement groups who opposed it. Been in the middle of all this stuff. And I learned some things. And I am not an academic, but I can tell you what works. And I wanted to share with you, before I share the solutions, which I know we'll get to, I wanted to share a couple of slides with you that to me really illustrate where we're at and why this topic is so timely. And I'm going to do that right now. This is what I'm looking at, folks. So I wanted to share with you this image. I hope you can see it. It talks about how divided is America. And the division we're talking about, it's in the context of our classes and our schools and our learning institutions. But it's also in the context of our families and our communities and our dinner tables and the people we love who sit across from us every day. These divisions don't just stop when we enter or exit a Zoom. These are around us all the time, and they've been getting worse over the last several decades. This example I want to share with you is from the 1960s when researchers asked Americans how they would feel if their daughter or son married someone of a different political ideology. At the time, nobody cared. 4% of Democrats, 5% of Republicans say they'd be displeased. Flash forward another 50 years, 2010, those numbers, people who would care, their son or daughter married someone of the opposite party, leapt to 33% and 49% respectively. This graph that you see on the right is a reflection of party polarization. Note where it starts, 1879, right after the Civil War. That was the high. Look where it's gone. It has dipped and then surpassed where we were immediately following the Civil War. If for some of you, you feel like we have never been more divided, you're right, we haven't, and not according to party polarization. And what happens is we end up living in a society where it feels like this person, got a person with a megaphone screaming at your ear, and it becomes very compelling to disengage. We don't want to listen to it. We want to tune it out. It's toxic. We don't want it in our lives. This image that I'm sharing with you shows that if you consider yourself a moderate, then that bar for moderate has shifted over time. This shows you how in 1994, where the median Democrat stood, and 64% of Republicans were to the right. Today, about over 90% of Republicans are to the right of the median Democrat. Same thing for the Democratic side. The median Republican in 1994 had 70% of Democrats to their left. Today, 94% of Democrats to their left. The polls are pulling farther apart. It's worse than that. The other bar graphs you see to the right talk about the favorability and perception of other party. So in 2014, we see that 38% of Democrats were viewed by Republicans, or Democrats viewed Republicans as very unfavorable, 38%. 27% of Democrats thought that Republicans were a threat to the nation's well-being. Well, Republicans reciprocate that view. 36% of Republicans see the Democratic Party as a threat to the nation's well-being. You don't invite the threat to dinner. You don't join the threat for a softball game or a barbecue, right? They're the threat. They're the enemy. We've gone to a point of I'm right and I disagree with you to I'm right, you're evil. And that's where things have pushed, and it has changed our perception of the economy. This graph shows how if you're a Democrat or a Republican, it affects your perception of the facts of the economy. The chart to the right shows how if you're a Democrat or a Republican, it affects your perception of your safety during coronavirus more than anything else. More than anything else, it has to do with your political views. And just to put a exclamation point on it, look at this, guys. This came out last year. This was a poll done at the National Capital Area Political Science Association, very reputable organization. They asked, do you think we'd be better off as a country if large numbers of the opposing party just died? And 15% of Republicans and 20% of Democrats said yes. So I'll stop screen sharing, but I did want to put that in context because that's where we're at. We're at a point where the other side is evil, and not only do we disagree with them, but they are a huge part of the problem. So when you feel it in our classrooms, it's not just there, it's everywhere. So that's my glum news to start with, but we're going to get better because we got solutions too.
Thank you, Kamy. Thank you for bringing your own personal story to your work and why you're doing the tremendous involvement of bringing people together in your center. So thank you for that. Ingrid, why do you think today is important to have this conversation at this moment?
So it's so important to have these conversations because we're in academia, right? And we want to have students critically engage with materials and critically think about things. So I was thinking about where these conversations take place within the classroom or within our spaces. And we can really think of it in different ways. I think oftentimes we immediately say, oh, it's going to be something verbal in a Zoom session right now, because that's our reality, whether it's our colleagues in a meeting or whether it's in the classroom setting. But these conversations can also take place in the chat. So thinking about how you can plan and be proactive within these conversations. So what are your plans if some of these conversations take place in the chat? Do you have Blackboard available to your students, and do you have discussion boards open to your students? So can conversations take place there? Are you using digital tools like Slack? So really just immediately thinking about how are my students going to engage with these conversations, and how am I going to engage as a faculty member with those students? So there's really three things that you can think about to be proactive that can help you set the groundwork for these conversations in your class. And you can start these now and then continue them into next week and hopefully continue them into the future, because they certainly carry into all kinds of different scenarios with challenging discussions. Having some kind of discussion guidelines. And this is great if you're in a classroom as well as in an office. You might have discussion guidelines. You might refer to them as discussion norms. These are things that you can, maybe you perhaps have them done from the beginning of the semester, but perhaps you don't have them, and this would be a great time to start that process with students. I'd say start it sooner rather than later and have a discussion with them and co-construct that so they're part of that process too. So how are we going to engage with these conversations, and what would you like this space to look like for yourselves? Also thinking about being inclusive with our materials as well as our discussion. So if we're looking at one political affiliation, can we look at both? Do we want to look at Republican and Democrat views on the same subject? So all students feel heard and included in that process. And then also thinking about how this could align with your course content. I think often there's very apparent ways that this would align. Obviously, if you're teaching in a political class, a class on politics, current events, policies, it's an immediate, right? But there are also ways that we can include this in other disciplines as well to have these important conversations. So in thinking about a performance class or a performance discipline, it might be that we talk about how to regulate emotions. How do we self-regulate? How do we let our emotions inform and impact our practice? If we're in art or music, thinking about how art and music can be used as therapy to help with our emotions and to help deal with these difficult times that we're in, because we are in difficult times, as Darlene said, from the beginning, with multiple things going on. So it's not just the election right now. I think everyone is tired. I know faculty wellness is an important part of what Ilene and Quade do. I'm very interested in that as well. And we have seen increased rates of faculty burnout and student burnout, for that fact, lack of motivation. And all of this runs in a cycle. So it all impacts each thing. So we want to make sure that we're taking care of ourselves, but also taking care of others. So those are just three ways that you can work with this within your classroom and be proactive. And as Kamy said, we'll be discussing more as we go along with questions. So thank you.
Thank you, Ingrid, for those reminders and quick things that we can do starting tonight if we teach and moving forward if we have not yet set up those discussion norms. Thank you. Ilene. You're on mute. You're not on mute. I'm not the only one.
That's right.
I have a partner.
And too bad it was my best information that we just lost, but okay, I'll try again. It's really a combination of what Ingrid and Kamy said, which is at Campus Wellbeing Education, we work with a lot of groups, and we're very familiar with the literature. And we really think it's best when we all kind of get together and all ideas and all perspectives are put on the table, and we build on those discussions and we have those discussions. And I agree, that's what higher ed is about. And I think we have an almost obligation to our world to build on these ideas together. The problem is the divisiveness, as Kamy brought it up, that there is what I call the other syndrome, where you're another, or you're not in my group, or you don't think how I think. And that becomes a problem because we don't have, we lose the common purpose of what it is, of what we're trying to achieve, which is a better world, hopefully, for all. And so when we look at this other concept, who is the other, I think it's important to kind of understand that in some circumstances, I may be viewing somebody else as the other, and at other circumstances, they may see me as the other. And what does that do for us working together? in certain situations, we can just ignore each other. We don't have to be together. And that's what I think we're seeing in our country, is that people are even in the activities that we do and even how we do those activities. But in a workplace or a educational setting, you can't not go to class just because you don't like the professor, or vice versa. You can't teach the student who has a different view from you. So this polarization, I love what is in the chat, is the survival of the fittest. And we become a very competitive group in who's going to get the power. So I think that is really opposite of what is well-being about, which is creating win-win situations for all people. And again, you have to buy that premise. And I'll just finish up that in the work that Quade and I do and the other people in the Campus Wellbeing and Education, we work with teams together a lot. And just the other day, I had someone say to me, I never want to see these people ever again in my life. The problem is she is the leader of all those people she doesn't want to see. She's literally, right? So other than a divorce, which means she has to leave her position, which she loves. And that's what we often find, is people love their work. It's who they work with that they may have the difficulty with in the work that we do. And so we really want to talk about, how do you start having these crucial conversations where you start looking for what's the shared meaning? What can we agree with together on? What can I agree person there, rather than what's the difference, and trying to influence the other and compete, as someone said in the chat box that's there. And how do we build on each other's common ground? And how do we kind of compare our story? And what do you do if you think the person's evil? As Kamy was saying, that you're actually attributing, so from a psychological piece, and many people are afraid that they will be seen as evil or say something wrong. Today, Quade and I were in a meeting, and the person was saying, I'm afraid to say anything because it's like pulling a thread on a sweater. I pulled the wool and the whole thing's going to unravel. And so really learning to be compassionate with each other, allowing ourselves to make mistakes. We come from different lived experiences. Unlearning what may be harmful to the other person and learning what is helpful. These are things that I think as an institution of higher learning, we have an obligation to do. And I think this is a perfect time to be doing this, to really look at, in some ways, why is this so important right now, is because we're at an opportunity, as I see it.
Thank you. So the first question I'm going to ask, and again, it's going to be a conversation, so feel free to respond to each other afterwards or add clarification. But I'd like you to all think of this question. It ties into everything that you've said, but maybe specific ways that we can address this. In our classrooms, in our office settings, I think all of us really want to create an environment that has respect and care for each other. That's our hope, that we walk into the office setting or create a climate in our classroom where people respect each other. But the reality is that sometimes that doesn't happen, and there are things that go on that we find out that we've harmed our relationships. And so what I would like to find out is, how can we avoid that if possible? Some of the things that Ingrid said to set that up, so we do not harm the relationships while sharing our different perspective on some issues that can be divisive. And how do we work through those differences if they do occur? And they will, in both offices or classrooms. Who would like to respond?
And this is Kamy here. I'll just offer one perspective. And this is based on just being in the middle of these debates and what works. For me, what works is sometimes people raise their volume and kind of get in your face and try really hard to make a point because they don't feel heard. And so in order for someone to feel heard, I think it's an act of listening. So rather than say that person is the problem because they're screaming at my face, I try to twist it around and say, maybe I'm not doing a good job of listening because why are they raising their voice? And I give this example. When I'm talking, if I talk really fast, I can talk at about 125 words a minute. That's pretty good. But your brain can hear words at about 400 words per minute. So there's a big gap between my talking and your listening. And what are you doing with the gap? Maybe you're not listening to me. Maybe you're thinking about, I'm hungry, maybe I'm gonna get a snack, or what did I sign up for this webinar, or what am I doing afterwards, or who's making noise in the other room, or whatever it is, you're not listening. And so the key to me is when we listen, you gotta listen not to respond. We're not waiting for our turn. We wanna listen to understand, like really understand what they're saying. And if you just think about that difference, I think it makes a huge difference in how the other person responds to you. We don't need to nod our head and repeat the words back to them and do all these things we've been taught to do. If you're listening, it's obvious. And so just listen. Number one thing you can do. I have more tips, but really for me, bottom line is start with that, and it will diffuse instantly many of the conflicts that could erupt.
Ilene or Ingrid?
I think it's important to be, as from a faculty perspective, important to be self-aware of what you're bringing into the space. So being able to consider what your day was like before you stepped into the classroom, and what is that going to look like, and how is that going to inform how you're going to react. So it's not only how the students are going to react, whether that's student to student or student to instructor, but also how you're interacting with those students. And I also think, to Kamy's point, thinking about how you can acknowledge and respect student opinions, and thinking to see the truth in it. And it might not be what the scholarship supports, and that could be another conversation that you have, but it is acknowledging that everyone has their own opinions and respecting that. And that certainly goes back to trying to create a very inclusive and welcoming environment from the beginning of the class. So is it a space where students feel comfortable and you feel comfortable expressing views and having these types of conversations, and having a willingness to learn, as well as being vulnerable, knowing that you're not going to be perfect. You're going to make mistakes. Everyone is, whether it's a student or whether it's you. We're going to say things that aren't correct or that could be offensive. I have a good friend who's a psychologist and a master life coach, and he always says to me, you say what you say, but people are going to hear what they hear. So we can focus on being as clear and intentional as possible as we say things. And I think that goes a long way.
I think what I want to add, because I agree with both what you're saying, is what are we trying to accomplish when we're in these groups or these relationships? Some of them are loving relationships, some of them are where they're teaching, but in all these cases, we typically want whoever we're with to be engaged, to be in there with us. And so if we're discounting what they're saying, if we're being disrespectful, that bridge could happen. And sometimes, as you said, Darlene, there could be a rupture that basically, I have two women who have been walking and hiking for 18 years, and I just joined them a couple of years ago, and they are no longer talking to each other because of their political views around the election. This to me was amazingly sad, because these were two women who love each other. And I was like, where is this coming from that it's so strong? And what really came is that they've lost the common values that they had, which is they're both extremely family oriented. They both believe in making the world a better place for people, but how they see a better place looks very different. And so in some ways, even in the conversation, if we could say to each other, I see that slightly differently, rather than you're wrong. And, and to be aware, I liked what you said, Ingrid, about being aware of self, because there's certain things that trigger people. It triggers it in me. It's like, no. And it's almost like you can't stop yourself from jumping out and saying it because it feels so disgusting to you, perhaps, or what broke them up was about immigration and the very differences that they have opinions. And what was interesting is if something, how to say this, that this is my experience and this is how I see it, as opposed to saying to the other person, you're evil, because in some ways that's the message, is like what you're thinking is so corrupt and so off. And when that happens, we create cultures of fear because someone's going to be cut off. And so we really want to work on how to kind of say our perspective and give it space, that you don't have to convince the other person, that this is where I am, and see if that person can build. And in the classroom, really, how do you build the conversation up to keep on adding to the conversation? Do others have this opinion? What's other things you would want to add? What are we missing here? Those kind of things.
I appreciate all the suggestions of active listening. I think that's something that I have to remind myself as an educator, that I should teach that explicitly, right? Not just assume that happens. And oftentimes in my career, I did not do that. And also doing that self-reflection and looking. So one of the questions that I'm hearing is, what do you do? How do you bridge that gap of when somebody who has this certainty, right? They're morally, I'm certain, and there's nothing you can do to make me change my mind, yet you want to engage in that conversation. You still want to have a conversation and a relationship with them. How do you begin to even broach that and break through that?
Darlene, this is Kamy here. So I think it's a very important question, and I really appreciate the way that you framed it. I think that one of the ways, perhaps the best way to bridge that gap, is the reason that there is a gap is not because there is a rational intellectual gap between your view and my view. We can have a civil debate about that. That's easy. You might think this about immigration, I think that about immigration. Fine, we talk it out. I hear your points, you hear my points. That's rational. We don't have to get angry. When people get angry, they're not getting angry because of a rational intellectual reason. This is emotional. This is moral. This is deep in my heart. I feel this. And so to bridge that gap, the first thing we got to do is acknowledge the emotion of it. And that's how we first engage immediately. That's why listening is so important. It acknowledges the emotion. Another strategy you could try for acknowledging the emotion is to say, it sounds like you're saying this. Right? And we can say back to the person, this is what I'm hearing you say. And you can say, that makes sense when you say it back, right? So you're acknowledging their emotion. And then when they felt heard, cortisol goes down, right? The tension goes down. They feel heard. Now there's no more reason to disagree. Now let's get into the issue. But I think it has to start there. And I can't tell you, Darlene, how many times this has happened. I'll share one quick story. I remember I was at a conference for marijuana activists. This is in the state of California. These are the people getting all the petitions across all the states to make it legal. And I invited a speaker from law enforcement who was leading the anti-medical cannabis stuff. The leading activist and the leading anti-activist were together after their debate and got to know one another. And the activist said, Kamy, I disagree with everything that comes out of his mouth, but, he reminds me of my dad. And I felt like I really needed to connect with him. And separately, he approached me afterwards and says, Kamy, you know what? No one has ever really listened to me and heard my arguments and challenged me on this way before, because they react very viscerally and emotionally. And he really appreciated being engaged intellectually. So take the emotion out of it. It's not hard to do. It's not complicated, but it is hard. That's what I mean. Not complex, but it is hard.
Yeah, the emotions are hard. And I think what you said at the end is that, like what Ilene said, find common ground. Try to find out that there's some commonalities that we have, and start from there is what sometimes I'll still say for myself, I forget to do. And it's always a good reminder to do that. Anybody else like to add to this question? Ilene, Ingrid?
Well, I think that there's comes a time where, as you said, Kamy, there's a moral feeling to this. Like, this is wrong. This is strong reaction of that this hurts me, this hurts others, or this is just wrong. And I think that's can be true, that you really believe something is wrong. The question, is it a time that you want to bridge this gap? Because can you really get rid of the other, of the other person, the other side? And how do you do it so it really moves that there are all voices around the table? So for me, I think, you feel strongly about something and it's there. How do we as people continue on what we think is right, without destroying kind of all these relationships? Because I don't believe you can do it alone. I think the issue is the sharing of the power and having all the voices. And how do you hear and by you listening to others, does that change the system because you're acting differently?
I think again, going to the question is that because we're talking about, we are working in a work setting and in our classrooms, and it is our hope that we can create that relationship, not harm the relationship, to continue to stay engaged, even though those differing viewpoints and that emotion, and working to see where we can find that common ground, and having all voices and ideas centered, at least to listen and begin to find that common ground. Thank you. Ingrid, did you want to add anything on this?
Just really thinking about trying to separate the emotion from the actual idea. So a lot of times in discussion norms, you'll have a discussion guideline that says, we criticize the idea, not the person. So to really go back against, to really, say we cannot shame anybody. We're not attacking that person because everybody comes to this with their own experiences. So we're really discussing for me, it's the scholarship, and that's how to keep framing it around the ideas.
So now I'm going to ask each of you a different question, and I'm going to start with you, Ilene.
Darlene, before we jump into that, do you mind if we just take a look at the chat? It's been pretty active, and I want to make sure that we get to some of these.
Yeah, I thought we were going to do that at the end, Disha. I misunderstood. So you want to do that now?
There's just a couple that I think might be some.
Okay, let me look at these. Okay. How do faculty facilitate discussions of students who have differing views and are emotionally charged, so as we don't personally interact with others, but as our role as faculty?
This is Kamy here. I think that's a great question because we want to have these discussions in our classrooms. If a person goes through K-12 education and they never talk about issues in the classroom, never talk about elections because it's hard, and then they go through college and they never talk about elections and issues because that's hard, then what have we got? We've got an uneducated person in the basic components of being an American citizen. They need to learn these things, and there's not a single class they can do it, so it's kind of all of our burden. We didn't cause this problem, but we're all part of the solution. So some of the things you can do, I think Ingrid said one key word, structure. When you impose structure on conversations, you are forcing emotion to be on the sideline. And maintaining the rules is a very easy way as a facilitator to make sure that the conversations don't go off the rails. I'm personally a big fan of structured debate. I don't know if there's space for it in your classrooms, but I think it's a great way to hear both sides and timed and point and counterpoint. But there's many, many ways to have structured conversations in your classrooms. And if you're not sure which particular one you want, Kamy Akhavan at usc.edu, I could give you lists and lists of different types of conversations you can use in your classes. But the bottom line is start with structure.
Thank you, Kamy. Good suggestions. So Ilene, to your question that I'm going to ask, we know that power dynamics play out differently in our classrooms and even within the students in terms of who has power by race, ethnicity, wealth, whatever those identities are, and in the office, and also with faculty and students and within the office as well. How do individuals who do not have the power in those settings take the first step to address their concerns and hope that they stay psychologically safe in what they consider a toxic environment?
It's a great question, Darlene. And many people face that because we have fears that if we speak up, that it won't be, received in a good way. And so the first step is really just to kind of know who are you talking to and who are you asking, and do you have an accurate read of this person? And also, do you need to speak up even if it's not going to go well? Sometimes we have to take these risks and say something and say it in the most polite way possible, but to basically say, this hurt me, or or stop. One of the things in the chat that came up was about bullies. If someone's bullying you or kind of pushing their stuff, how do you turn around and kind of say, stop, can we take some space here? But I also think it's important to have allies and to really talk about, if you're, in the classroom or in a group or even in a faculty meeting, that you're not the only one who speaks up. And we see this oftentimes with junior faculty who don't have tenure yet, for example, who may be afraid to say something to a group that has tenured, because it's like, okay, is this going to jeopardize, my promotion by saying that I was offended, or, this isn't okay. And that's a tough one because people get really afraid. On the other hand, if it keeps on going, if we do not say something, it becomes the norm. Bullying becomes the norm in the classroom. If we as instructors don't kind of change it, and I love the prevention piece of starting with the norms to begin with, but sometimes those norms aren't adhered to, is how to bring it back to, wait, what are we trying to accomplish here? And even addressing that, and let's look at this piece to move forward. And so when you have the power differential, it is scary. And we need to realistically judge. But on the other hand, at some point, if you keep on letting it go and happen, then that becomes the established way. And we want to also offer that, whether it's campus well-being and education, the ombuds, there are places you can go for consultation, so you don't have to work quickly. You don't have to quickly, you can think about, how do you approach this person? Sometimes it's better to do it privately versus then in front of everybody, so there's not a shame factor. But other times it may be important to talk to others on how to bring it up as a group in the most respectful way as possible.
Adding to that, I'm going to ask you, Ingrid, it's a shift of the question I was going to ask you, but it's a question in the chat. How do faculty handle situations when one perspective within the classroom is actually adding trauma or harm to others in the class, and making sure that we don't center dominant voices that are harming our marginalized students? And then the question I was going to ask, you could add to that, how do we de-escalate that in the classroom?
So definitely thinking about, again, creating that inclusive environment up front where students feel empowered, whether that's, you call it a safe space, brave space, a space for them to feel empowered that they can go to another student and say, hey, that was really hurtful to me, and this is why. And now not every student's going to do that, and we know that, but encouraging them to do that and modeling that behavior as well. So as faculty, it's part of our really our obligation to model these behaviors too, and to enact them within our space. So that's the first kind of ground rule. In terms of there are going to be comments, because again, everybody's coming from different places, and we never know what's going to be triggering for someone else, because we don't have their autobiography, right? We're not in their lived experience. So it is difficult, but to be able to say, also observe behaviors. And so if you see someone pulling away or someone reacting in a specific way, to say, wow, was that hurtful to you? That was not my intent, let's have a discussion about this. That was not what I intended. This is what I meant. And this is where I wanted this to go. So you being brave enough to do that as well, and vulnerable enough. So it's both people, right? It's both. In terms of de-escalation, so some of the ways that you can do this is kind of a psychological disarming technique, and going ahead, and when you see things getting escalated, expressing the gratitude. So say it was an interaction between a student and a faculty member. So Ingrid's upset and I'm the faculty member. So now I'm going to say, okay, Ingrid, well, thank you for bringing that up. You're right. I did not address the Republican side of this. And, obviously I can understand why that was hurtful to you. So let's have that discussion. And let's include that in this discussion and move on. That's how I would handle it. I open it up to Kamy and to Ilene to also add into that other ways that you can handle it. So, and I think the thing is too, to be authentic to yourself in terms of how you want to move ahead. I will say, because there was a question about disruptive student behavior, in terms of that, there is a USC policy in what constitutes disruptive student behavior. It is not rude or uncivil behavior in the classroom. It is literally when you can't move forward with the teaching or students can no longer learn within that space. So, and then that obviously necessitates an additional layer of what you need to do and address. So Ilene, Kamy?
Want to add?
Yeah, Jesse has something in the chat that I want to bring up, which is when someone has an impact that's particularly harmful, particularly to our BIPOC community, or something said, these are really tricky. In higher education, we've had this debate that there's a thing called free speech. And I think Quade even brought this up, like free speech, even if you hurt somebody. And I personally feel that no, there are limits. And sometimes we need to say this is not okay. I remember in my own graduate training, one of our instructors who had the power talked about her belief in eugenics and that certain races were superior in certain skills. And I found it particularly offensive. And, in terms of, so what do you do in these kind of situations? Because we don't want it to fall on our BIPOC students, faculty, staff, that they're have to speak up or whatever. And I often think of the person who has the most privilege in the room has the obligation to really speak up. The person who has the most safety and power, that we really need to be the ones to speak up and say something. And so what do you say when someone says something that is really painful and putting down? It's not just a disagreement of opinion, it's really an oppression. It's really a way of systematically cutting and devaluing others, whether it's through name calling, whether it's through questioning their competence, whatever it might be. Those are the things that then I turn around if I have, hopefully I have the power to do so and the courage to do so. And I try to give the other person the benefit of the doubt to some extent, but I also kind of say, I stand here and I'm listening to this. And for me, when you say that, I think that's harmful because we're not doing our principle, which is respecting people. And if the person doesn't buy on to respecting people, there's not much I can do about that other than to manage the conversation. But that is what do any of us think that shouldn't be a value here at USC, is respecting others? So I think that it's the sense when those devaluing come, and I think particularly as a white woman, I have a obligation and a right, and it's uncomfortable, but to say that crosses a line because you're devaluing others. And that's different than having a different opinion. That is putting someone down. That is pressing them, into a space. So I think there's a difference there than having a difference of opinion.
Oppression. How would you? I know we have staff in the room as well. How would you? That goes back to the question I asked earlier about a toxic environment and power dynamics. When a supervisor may do something that is harmful to a staff member and they're not able, what suggestion? Do they go to another staff member? How do they handle that with the power dynamics of their job? What advice would you give a person who feels that environment is really not allowing them to thrive and they feel threatened? because I think in the classroom, as you said, as a professor, that's my role. I'm responsible for that. That's my power dynamic that I can take to benefit students who are hurt and marginalized. But what about staff that may have, or from a faculty member that may have not treated them with respect? And all of us have heard, I mean, I won't say, but I've heard many, not many, but conversations about that. How do we give them the support to feel supported by others in the organization, in their department?
This is Kamy here. I'll offer a couple of strategies that I think might be useful. And I'll preface it with this. We try hard. All of us on this call are here for a reason, because we're trying to facilitate productive conversations. So I think everyone's intent is to be applauded, right? These are courageous conversations. As hard as we try, there are some people we try to connect to, and it just doesn't work. They're going to be rude. It's not going to work, right? So we keep trying to build the bridge, and they just will not receive it. So as much as I believe in bridging divides, I know that there's some times to say, this ain't working, switch course, and now it's time to mitigate damage, right? So that's a different strategy. So that said, knowing that there's people we can't reach, I think there's times where we also, if somebody says something that we find deeply offensive, then the first thing I tell myself is, I must have heard that wrong, because they wouldn't have said that, right? I think I know that person. I want to be generous in interpreting what they said. And what I tell myself is, it's that person's birthday. I swear I do this. I say, if it's that person's birthday, I will give them a slight benefit in interpretation, and I'll be generous. And I'll ask them to rephrase what they said as an open-ended question. So, for example, what I won't do is say, when you said that, were you being horribly racist? No, that's a loaded question, and it's not an open-ended. What I could say is, what exactly did you mean when you said that? Can you explain it to me further? And then it's an open-ended question, and then they explain it, and then I think, oh, okay, they're really not a jerk. They said it the wrong way. So it's hard to be generous in interpretation, but for me, it's one of the 5 pillars, I'd say, of being an effective bridge builder. But that said, if you're trying and it ain't working, then you're not doing anything wrong. It could be them.
I like it being generous and clarifying that, because I agree. I would say 99.9% of us really want to do the right thing. We don't want to hurt anybody, and we want to engage and stay in relationships. Kamy, I have a question for you. And a few weeks ago, we had a conversation when we were in this planning sessions. You mentioned that your work is focused on learning to disagree better. Could you tell us more about what you mean by this statement and how it can be demonstrated in our day-to-day lives? Learning to disagree better. You're on mute.
Sorry, I appreciate your question a lot. One of the ways that I think we can learn to disagree better is, and the reason I say it is because a lot of conversation strategies are focused around, let's find the common ground. I think common ground can often be a unicorn. Good luck finding it, right? So the second strategy is we don't need to disagree less, we just need to disagree better. And we need to take a lot of the emotion out of that conversation so we can really have a more intellectual or rational discussion around ideas. And we can criticize ideas without criticizing each other. So one of the ways to frame it, I think, that's very useful is to think the problem we have in our country, in our communities, in our classrooms, at our dinner tables with partisanship is not my fault. I did not end the Cold War, taking away a common enemy that kind of unified us all. I didn't make it go from 3 or 4 television networks to 3,000 now where people can self-select which one. I did not invent social media algorithms that keep reinforcing my own ideologies and estrange me from others. I didn't make it to where people feel more comfortable sitting down in front of the TV with Rachel Maddow on or Sean Hannity and never the twain shall meet, right? I didn't invent gerrymandering. I didn't erode bipartisan precedent in Congress. I didn't make it to where money has an oversized influence in politics. I did not eliminate a lot of the critical thinking strategies from the high schools by eliminating social studies programs and civics instruction like someone in the chat mentioned, I didn't cause these problems. I'm living with them. All of us are living with them. And I think when we think about it that way, it makes it kind of easier. I think it makes it to where we think, I didn't cause this, but I can be part of the solution. So in all of the disagree better conversations, things that I mean is it's really incumbent on us, I think, to one is to listen for sure. Start there. Number two is ask ourselves some questions. So when someone says something to us that we want to just respond immediately and emotionally to, ask some filtering questions. Did they mean it that way? Who is that person? Why would they say such a thing? And ask these questions. And what it does is it gets your thinking out of that reptile part of your brain that's fight or flight and into this more intellectual, prefrontal cortex part that is more rational and is not going to get super upset about things. So that's two, it's just filter your thoughts with questions. And third is, I think, force ourselves to seek opposing views. It's hard to do it. And I don't mean a drip, 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 like I normally listen to Rachel Maddow, but I'm going to force myself to listen to Sean Hannity. Not like that. I mean, go and find really compelling, good arguments from the other side that you disagree with, and just see like the other side is not coming from an insane place. They're just coming from a different perspective that we need to appreciate, or at least learn how they're thinking. That's three. Number four is, I mentioned being generous in interpretation. That's key. And five, as I said, disagree better and finding common ground is elusive. But one of the ways that you don't have to seek it, it comes to you, is think about it this way. UCLA and USC, we're rivals, right? But you could say, hey, we're all LA family. Oh, we did something in psychology called superordination. I hope I'm saying that right, psychologists. Superordination, where we have now found a bigger in-group, right? And so now let's say it's a LA University versus Harvard. Like, oh, we don't like Harvard. Oh, or Notre Dame. Hey, we're all universities. We all believe in higher education. Oh, great. Now we aligned ourselves. What about people without who are not in universities and who are in universities? How do we identify? Oh, we all believe in education, regardless if it's an institution or not. We keep expanding the in-group. So I think when we look at the other, as you mentioned, Ilene, think of the other and realize they're the other because of this one thing we picked out about them. But in any other way, they're not the other at all. They're the other because of their belief in this one issue. And if it wasn't for that issue, they would not be the other. And so I think we just have to teach ourselves to superordinate and realize our in-group is much bigger than it is. And we are not nearly as divided as our politics would have us believe.
Good point. We do have more in common if we just do that subordination and find it till it's the universe. Thank you, Kamy. I didn't see this question earlier, so I want to go back to it. I think it's more really into specifically as a faculty member next week, right, on Tuesday. Are there specific questions you suggest we pose when we open up a space to check in and process the elections with students next week during class time? Like Wednesday, Thursday, Friday. We don't know yet if the outcome is going to be that soon. We don't know. So what just suggested, your thoughts?
I think, I'm teaching Tuesday night from 4 to 7. And what I've kind of decided to do is to really start off class. We've already talked about that. We're going to focus on some content for 45 minutes. It's almost a 2 and 40-minute class. And then we're really going to talk about how are we feeling and what is that about and how to connect it. And in my case, I can connect it back to the content that I'm teaching. So we've decided to really do that. I know that some other people have chosen even not to have class on Tuesday night because of this, but my group, I only have 12 graduate students in my class. We've decided we want to meet and really support each other and to kind of remember, regardless of how it goes, that we can still make the world a good place to live. And I think when we think in absolutes that if X happens, we've lost our world or our world has become horrific, there are still things that we can do to empower ourselves, even if we believe that the person who's voted is terrible for us. I don't think we should give up the fight. So talking with students, how they can feel empowered and also not to believe just because their candidate won that life is now fantastic. We still have an obligation to how do we create locally and nationally and globally a wonderful world. So I think having those conversations and really taking a little time to just check in with people. How are people doing? Because, and there's a gamut. I have some students who, it sounds funny, but couldn't care less about the election. And, you know, they just kind of feel like, you know, I'm kind of following it. It's, you know, I get my news through Noah. You know, I'm forgetting his first name. But, you know, I mean, so I think really opening it up to some discussion to look at that piece. And again, not being a therapist, but people have fears. And maybe our job as faculty or staff is to really kind of keep a kind of calm sense that the world will still go on regardless. And I think that's hard. We have to check our own feelings too, because that's hard for us to believe, you know, as well. It's a hard one, Darlene.
Mm-hmm. Any others, Ingrid?
So I would say too, you can think about how you want to handle it, and it might be helpful to kind of have that emotional piece maybe in a quiet self-reflection. So you're just giving 5 minutes and maybe some prompt questions. There was an article in Inside Higher Ed that had some prompt questions on how to reflect about the election. So that might just be a quiet piece. It could be something like a word cloud or a Google Doc where students are sharing, or in the chat, you know, so think about ways that you kind of want the students to express themselves and how you're going to deal with that. And then I would again say, you know, if it's aligned with what you're doing in your course, think about the scholarship or articles or videos that you could bring in that might help students with this as well. So you're acknowledging their emotions, you're also bringing it into the discipline side of things. And then I would also just remind you to also talk about the support services that are available on campus for students as well, to just remind them and encourage them to take part in that as well. So the conversation doesn't have to stop in your classroom after 7 o'clock at night. We have other options on campus, and I believe we're going to be sharing some of those options with you at the end of this session. So I know Student Affairs has a lot of things going on, so encouraging students to do that and to seek help and other allies and friends and a support system that they can speak with too.
Yeah, and if I can, I want to add a few things to that. So to Ingrid's point, there's plenty of resources on campus. There's election therapy sessions for students through the Student Health Center twice a week. And folks from the Department of Psychology were meeting, I mean, top professionals are meeting with students for these drop-in therapy sessions to deal with stress. 75% of university students are reporting high degrees of stress because of this election. So if people are kind of acting out, lashing out, I mean, it's understandable. There's a lot of tension there. So that's for the students, but then for us, right? What about for us? I could tell you in this last week, I've been on 2 calls with business executives, like senior people, super wealthy. You know how we started those calls? With breathing techniques. I thought it was so odd, but the first thing they did is they said, we're going to take a minute, close your eyes, breaths. And then we went through these breaths. And as weird as I thought it was, after the minute, I was so grateful for it, right? So controlling your breathing, being aware of it, for me is important. The other one is unplug, right? A lot of the negativity that we're seeing, we're getting it from our television screens, from our phones, from Twitter. Unplug, and we won't be exposed to that stuff that's toxic. You can get your news in 10 minutes and you'll know what's happening, right? We don't need it constant negativity. And then the third thing I think is connection, right? We're living in a time, like you said, Darlene, at the very beginning, there's a global pandemic, economic uncertainty, pushes for racial justice, all of these things converging while we're isolated at home behind our masks, right? It's very isolating. So connecting is something we as human beings, it's in our species, we're supposed to do it, and it's hard to do. So call a friend, right? Just pick up the phone and call somebody. Go knock on your neighbor's door and stand 20 feet away and have a conversation with them. Having a human connection, I think, really lower the stress levels. So unplug, connect with the pal, and remember to breathe.
And on November, I just want to tell everyone on November 5th, we are having a discussion groups for faculty and staff after the election. So that is through, if you know the series, equity, race, it's race, equity, and well-being. So if you put that in the USC search bar, it'll pull up and you can get the registration.
I had a question on whether Zoom has helped us do better or not online, but I have a question that a participant asked, so I'm going to read it. It's fairly long, the introduction, but I think the question is very interesting. So he says, considering all the mask wearing that we wear in real life, right? You know, put on our mask, I put my suit on, I'm ready, and this is who I look and am. I've been thinking a lot about how hard it is to express how we're feeling. I think we could benefit from improving how we share our own emotions and read those of others. The best ideas I could think of was using ASL for general emotions. Then he gives a link on the to do that. For adults and children, as well as teachers and students, I think something like this could be helpful, especially when checking in with each other and with social emotional learning aspects. What are some thoughts you have for non-verbally improving our ability to express and perceive emotions during COVID-19 and beyond, and in respectful ways that improve communication? And I'm adding that because we're going to be doing this for a while, at least for us, we know till January for SC, for the online. How do we improve that on Zoom and where we are? Well, we're going to have the importance of still maintaining these relations when we go back in person. So how do we make sure we're not doing something that could harm, intentionally or not intentionally?
I really like that question because it's an awfully hard one to tackle. And I'm not saying I have the answer, but here's what I've found effective. So in the classroom settings, when there's 50 faces on a screen, 100 faces on a screen, it's really hard to make a meaningful connection with a person. When we switch into breakout rooms and it's 2 or 3 people in a breakout room, that's when the connection becomes far more intensive and memorable. And so I've had students report that a class that was an hour long, half of it was lecture, and then the other 30 minutes of it was breakout room. They don't even remember what happened in the lecture. They remember what happened in those 2 to 3 people that they really connected with. So I'd say if the issue is connectivity, shrink the circle, right? Shrink the circle so that you can maintain eye contact, even if it's through your camera. It's better than nothing. Do that. And using the emoticons on Zoom, it sounds silly to do thumbs up and claps and things like that, but I tell you, the students that I was talking to, they're used to that vocabulary and it is appreciated. So I've been clapping and thumbs upping my heart out, right? And they love that. So I'd say do that as a form of connectivity. And the other one I think is doing things that you can do physically and they can do physically synchronously, concurrently. And that's where I think those breathing exercises together can somehow be grounding and connecting. So even though like it might sound weird or silly to do it, in the era of Zoom, these are some of the techniques that can work.
Ilene or Ingrid, would you like to add?
I think, the question's a great one because as you said, Kamy, it's like, how do we do this? It's not so easy, but it is really kind of tone and pace and also level of vulnerability, kind of being online and kind of sharing things in a certain way, and being human. So I think as much as we can show ourselves, the better, to kind of share and to kind of moderate, particularly if we're the leader, some calmness, and that we don't have to rush through everything and not everything has to be at super stage, that we need to be particularly calm during this time, and considerate, and give space for also those who don't talk. I think it's been really important in the classroom or even in faculty meetings to purposely say to people, you know, we've heard a lot from a lot of people, but some of you have been quiet. I would love to hear what you're thinking or put it in the chat. And I have to say, one of the advantages of the online is the chat, because there are many people who may not have spoken up in class before or in meetings, and we're getting a whole bunch of information and going, Kamy, to your things, people are going like, right on, Ingrid, you know, like, you know, good point, Kamy, you know, that is really great. So I think it's an advantage, and we want to encourage that kind of reaching out. But you know, I'm waiting till we're all back in person again too. And does that make us kind of become almost more aware, to Christopher's question, of each other, because we're really seeing each other non-verbally in a way that we haven't before. So it should be interesting to see.
There's a question about any recommendations to you coming about the next week or 2 weeks that we have that would be easy to use for cloud medium to have students record their emotions in an anonymous manner. And Disha had added Mentimeter, but are there others that might be helpful for us to look at and use?
Yeah, depending on how you want to use it in the classroom. So I see Jesse has mentioned Discord. Thank you for that one. There's one called GELL, G-E-L-L. That's also good. These are just platforms for structured conversation. It might not fit exactly what you're trying to teach, so you have to kind of dig around, but I like that one quite a bit, because you can white label and create your own questions and go from there, and you can do it anonymously, or you can do it with your identity shown. Google Forms is one that some of the student staff that I work with at the Center for the Political Future, among themselves, that's what they use, because they believe strongly in being able to anonymously comment. And so I'm all for it. We want critical feedback, pro or con. And so we've been using Google Forms a lot as well.
Yeah, I would say everything that's mentioned, including Jamboard, which is available through the Google Suite. So that's something that's accessible to all here at USC. And thinking about too, in terms of the question, how can you create these opportunities for students to engage with one another? So thinking about your assignments, whether it's group assignments, whether it's thinking about opportunities for them to interview one another and maybe create a small video with some questions. Maybe you give them 3 questions to ask of another student, and then they have 2 optional questions that they can ask. I mean, all of these things help with that, as well as you as the professor and your relationship with the students too, is being observant of the behaviors that you're seeing. You know, I mean, it is our reality now. We're used to seeing the whole person, the 5 foot, 6 foot tall person right in front of us. And now we're seeing like this 3x2 little thumbnail thing on our screen all the time, and you can't see the whole body language. Students turn off their camera. You know, there's a multitude of things going on. So really being observant and reaching out when you have a concern, whether that's directly to the student or if you have more concerns, something like support and intervention on campus.
Thank you. And again, there was a participant that said they're going to reach out to Ingrid for help. I think we'd have to give a shout out to CET. They're there to help and give you some suggestions, and want to know that we're going to give her more work over the next couple of weeks, but that's okay. They're ready and able to help us. So thank you, Ingrid, for that. I think people have already probably emailed you when you get back to your email full box. There was a question that was a clarifying question, but I think it was deleted. I think, could you clarify, Ilene, when you talked about the eugenics? I think there was a misconception about what you said and what was intended. So if you could clarify when you had that experience about whether an opinion or whether it should be done, it should continue. I think that's where the clarification.
Oh, right. So just to clarify, I'm not an expert in eugenics. This was me as a student in a classroom with a professor saying this. And what my point was being is that any concept that puts down someone by race, by their color of their skin, a group identity, that or even as individuals, when we discount another or kind of degrade them, if you will, to me, that is a line that is not acceptable, because we can't have learning if we're making people less than others. I hope that, Darlene, is that what you were hoping to get the clarification?
I think that's what helped for me. Yes, and I think it helped
Yeah.
for the audience. So we're winding down to the last 4 or 5 minutes. So I want to close. And again, thank you, participants, for adding to the chat. And with my misunderstanding, I thought we were going to wait till the end, but it worked out better this way. So thank you for doing that. Appreciate the panelists going with it and having a conversation. I want to close with one question I'm going to ask each of you. Again, thank you for your sharing your personal experience, your professional experience, your expertise, and your wisdom for all of us, because I think we've learned a lot. But what I want to do, in addition to everything you shared, I'm going to ask for some more, right? I'm just going to ask you to give more. Give us some advice, what advice you would give us to have hope and remain positive over the next couple of weeks, so that we can navigate the feelings and emotions that we have. We want to keep them positive and have hope over the next month, during the remainder of the school year, and as we enter into 2021.
Right. I love ending on hope. Thank you for that question, Darlene. I'll share a couple of stats that to me are hopeful. Number one is a lot of the problem of polarization in our country comes from what Ingrid, I think, rightly described as this lack of critical thinking. We lack the ability for empathy and connecting with other people and thinking through problems and respond emotionally. And so critical thinking to the rescue. It is only recently that the National Council for Teachers of English, the National Math and Science Initiative, and the National Council for the Social Studies, all the biggest groups in K-12 ed, have focused on making critical thinking a core part of their curricula. So to me, that's Cavalry is on the horizon, and they're going to be teaching more of these skills at the K-12 levels. But in addition to that, recent polling is showing that, and I'm quoting here, 65% of Americans consider themselves part of the exhausted majority. They agree that we need to listen and compromise. 3 out of 4 Americans think our differences are not so great that we can't come together. We can bond over issues like how many of us have had family members or loved ones deal with issues of addiction. Do we know if those people were D's or R's? Who cares, right? We have that thing in common. Or what about people who love cars, or people who carry non-visible illnesses, or someone who has lost a loved one to suicide, or people who have phobias, or people who love their grandchildren? I'm saying there's a lot of ways for us to relate to one another as human beings, and we need to remember that, knowing educational systems are coming around, knowing that a lot of these problems are cyclical, and knowing that we have far more in common than our politics would believe. For me, is what gives me hope.
Thank you, Kamy. Ilene or Ingrid?
Well, what gives me hope is approaching with curiosity as opposed to judgment. So if we could all keep that in mind as we're interacting with one another, as we're engaging with different materials that might be unfamiliar to us. And I think that's really the core of why we work, or we are students, or we're staff members at a university of higher ed. So I think that's an important thing to keep in mind and frame as we move forward.
I like that, because I think if we stay curious, we stay open. And that's, I think, the lesson, or one of the many lessons you shared today, is let's be open and see if we can listen and hear and find that area that we can move forward to for the greater good. Ilene.
What I find helpful and keeps me optimistic is, I think as human beings, we are wired for connection, and that we want love, and we want to love each other. And that if we can remember and not put our armors up to protect because we're afraid of hurt, that we're really more resilient as a group than we give ourselves credits to. And so if we can keep open, curiosity, but open to the love, to the connection, I think that will bring us to a better place, and to give people benefit of the doubt, and also just keep on kind of trying to connect.
Well, can't do my emoji here, but I know that if I asked all the participants to do the clap, I would like everyone here today to again thank this amazing panel for your wisdom, your experience, and sharing everything. I think you left me with a lot of hope and things that I can do to address my own fear and anxiety, but hopefully to alleviate and give grace to my students and my community that I work with every day. So again, Kamy, thank you so much. Ilene, thank you so much. Ingrid, thank you so much. And Quade, thank you for starting us off with reflection and giving us that opportunity to be grounded. Thank you. And Kimberly, you're a rock star having this happen. And Disha, another rock star. Thank you from Dornsife and Jason for making this happen. I'm now going to turn it over to Disha, who's going to close with some other resources and support. Disha.
All right, let me make sure I'm unmuted. So I am just going to get this in presentation mode. So I just want to share some of these resources, and we will be making these available to everybody who has attended. We'll send this out via email. We'll have this up on our Office of Diversity website as well. So here are some campus resources that you see to your, I always get this part confused. It's on my left, so I hope it's on yours too. We have Campus Wellbeing Education, our office, of course, Office of Dornsife Office of Diversity, our USC Dornsife Office of Diversity, Rossier, Center for the Global Future, Center for Excellence in Teaching. We also want to direct you to Ombuds and the Center for Work and Family Life as additional resources. And attached here are some links. These are all clickable links, which is some articles from Greater Good and Inside Higher Ed, those questions that were mentioned earlier. This is the article that has those questions in it. And on this side, you can see some of the links to the word cloud features that you can use on Mentimeter, Jamboard, Gel, Padlet, Discord, and Google Forms. And finally, there's a couple other ones here. The first one that you see here is the resources for students, that's Student Affairs. And that Student Affairs is hosting for students this week, next week, and I believe the week or two after as well. So you can feel free to share these with your students. And with that, we will be sharing the next webinars that we have planned over the next couple of weeks. Like Ilene mentioned, we will have a listening session next week with details to come. At the end of the week, we'll be sending out an email again. And the week after, we will be hosting another webinar on bridging divides and having conversations within the community. And then we will wrap our final session with what does this mean now for our community at USC, our community in general, and for the world. So we're hoping to see you all at the next few sessions, and thank you for your time, and we will see you soon.